Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Analysing Anfield, your tactics and analytics podcast, courtesy of the Blood channel. I'm Josh Williams and I'm joined by Mo Stewart once more. Mo, how does it feel, mate, to make your second appearance?
I'm glad that I've already got one out of the way because I'd hate for this to be my debut, to be honest with you. I said to you just before, I'm not exactly eagerly anticipating this, but that's not entirely true because there's been times in the past where kind of talking it out has actually made me feel better. So in some ways, I am looking forward to this. In some ways, I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that your initial debut was going to be a struggle considering we just threw 1-1 at home to Crystal Palace. And your second appearance is a loss to Manchester United. So it's not looking good so far. Not a great start. But slightly better start than Nunes, I think. But not a great start. So we've got to deconstruct it. You know, that's why we're here. It'll probably take up most of the episode, I assume, because there's a fair few talking points around this and a little bit of fallout and things like that. So, yeah, I think we might as well just get straight into it, mate. So, in terms of the game, again, before we go too detailed, general thoughts on how it went. What are your thoughts on how Liverpool performed? Did we deserve anything? Things like that.
Disappointing was my first thought. It was the second game in a row where I thought we'd see a reaction and we didn't. And once it happens twice, then it becomes potentially an issue. And I mean, there are so many things about individual performances that are subjective. Like I saw so many people after the game saying, "Oh, 10 of them played rubbish, but there was one who was all right." But there was like 4 or 5 different players who were the one. So that part's subjective. But the one thing that everybody agreed on, the one thing that wasn't subjective was the application, the effort, the energy. It was almost like they forgot they were playing at Old Trafford. And not only did they forget they were playing at Old Trafford, they were playing against a wounded animal who'd had a long time to stew on their last terrible result and build for this game. So the fact that they weren't ready to meet it on that level was really worrying for me. And I don't really think we saw that until the last 10 minutes of the game, which again is worrying in itself. And you start to question yourself, if you can't raise yourself from Man United away, why?
Yeah, I agree with you, mate. I think the start was concerning. We looked all over the place. It wasn't just. I mean, a lot of it was application, a lot of it was effort, but it was also just kind of like a mishmash of players all over the place. You know, positionally versatile and things. And we'll get to why that was the case a little bit, but it just didn't really benefit anybody. And considering Liverpool couldn't keep the ball either, whenever the ball got turned over, we were wide open on a number of occasions. So yeah, it wasn't a great performance. I think gradually Liverpool came into it. Liverpool got better in the second half, and I've actually seen one or two people say we were the better team and things, and I can understand why they say that in terms of Liverpool maybe dominating the ball and having a few more shots and things like that than Manchester United. But I do think generally they applied themselves well. They were quite obviously committed to the cause. The fans got behind them. They adjusted their game plan specifically for Liverpool, and it just resulted in a bit of a collapse at the start, especially as you say, Liverpool just very uncharacteristically not up for the scrap at the beginning. I'm not sure whether you can put that down to the midfield department, maybe aging players, a few injuries in the team. I'm not sure what it is, but it was weird, wasn't it?
I feel like it was a collection of a lot of things. Like in years gone by, you go into a game against Man United and you see Henderson and Milner in the same midfield, and you think, okay, that makes sense. Klopp wants to set the tone. He wants to kind of go out there and be aggressive. But the simple fact is that where we are now in 2022, I'm not sure that Henderson and Milner fit that remit anymore. That's not really what they're there for, particularly when Henderson's playing as the 6, which means he has to be a little bit more disciplined and controlled by nature. So it was almost like the wrong team for the wrong plan, or the wrong plan for the wrong team, whichever way around you want to say it. But it did look like they weren't really empowered to go out there and do damage to Manchester United in a way that Manchester United clearly were.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think first of all, I think we should probably touch on Ten Hag and the changes that he imposed, because We talked about this last week when we previewed the game, and we were really toying with the thought of a coach from Ajax who's very idealistic, maybe in his approach. We was toying with the prospect of him being so philosophical in his ways and so committed to his ways that he was going to try and build from the back with David De Gea against the best pressing team in Europe. Sadly, he's not stupid, and he didn't do that. From the first 5 seconds, we pretty much witnessed David De Gea is going to go long all game. So straight away, Liverpool's ability to press and gain opportunities from those situations was immediately ruled out, really, which I'm sure Klopp probably worked on before the game, to be honest. And on top of that, in terms of their personnel changes, they probably made all the changes I would have made, if I'm honest. They took out Harry Maguire, who's just experienced in a tough period at the minute, brought in Varane, took out Cristiano Ronaldo, and put Marcus Rashford up front through the middle, which I thought was a problem. Brought in Elanga for the flanks, and also took out Luke Shaw and brought in the lad Malaise. And they did look a lot better. They looked a lot more suited to the game plan. A lot of the players who've basically let them down for years now were kind of taken out the side. And so I do think, I'm not sure Klopp will have been ready, as prepared for that as he would have been for the Man United we've seen for the previous 2 games. And B, I think Ten Hag absolutely got it right, to be honest, in what he did, and it did influence the game.
Well, starting at the back, Ten Hag definitely did get it right, and we do have to give him credit for that. I think the idea in terms of him changing that particular part of his philosophy, I think it was purely down to, let's not do anything that can put ourselves under pressure early on in the game. And playing out from the back is obviously the first thing. Like we said, it was definitely going to be part of our game plan. So the way that they were able to eliminate that straight away was very smart. In terms of who else they brought in as well, I'm like you, I'm a big fan of Malaise. I think he's going to very much improve their team. We all know what Rashford's capable of against Liverpool. We've seen it before. And like you say, it was a team more capable of setting out and performing the game plan. And they'd obviously been instilled with confidence to go out and do that. It was almost like they knew that they were going to catch us on the hop. But they were lucky in some instances. Like, for example, a partnership of Varane and Martinez would have been a lot more tested by Darwin Núñez, for example, or if Liverpool had any striker with any kind of physical presence and height. But we didn't have that, so that made that choice a lot easier. So there was some circumstance that went into it as well. But even going aside from all of those things, I think the approach to the game, the fact that Manchester United came into the game with confidence and were buoyed by that early start and were able to translate that early start into a goal, which then buoyed them even further. They were able to kind of build from the fragile mess that they were, block by block. And the experienced side that Liverpool are, as I've said, I'm probably going to keep saying over the show, should have been able to see and anticipate what they were trying to do and deal with it, but they didn't.
Yeah. I mean, I must say, I don't think this is a corner turned for Manchester United by any means. I think this is a one-off game. They adapted their approach for Liverpool. It worked.
I mean, if I'm honest, it kind of felt like it's going back to Solskjaer. That's kind of where they were back to. The Solskjaer underdog team, where they're scrappy and they'll go out there and they'll put their effort in, and they'll sometimes overturn teams because they can absorb a lot of pressure. Like, going back to what we were saying last week about the Palace game, you can look at the game and say Liverpool dominated the game. Like you were saying, some people said that we held the better team. But Liverpool dominating the ball and not creating chances is part of Man United's game plan. That is in it. That's what they want us to do. So then they can go out and hit us with the space. And that's what they did. So you can look at it from both ways. But in terms of Man United being able to repeat that specific performance with those personnel against the other 18 teams in the league, I'd hold off if I was you.
Yeah, I would as well. They've got Southampton this weekend. De Gea will probably go back to building from the back again, and once they start doing that again, teams will pick them off. Teams will cause problems. I do think they'll be a lot better with a figure up front that isn't Cristiano Ronaldo and isn't Christian Eriksen. So if it was Rashford up front or Martial seems to be back now, they will do better, I think, generally, and Casemiro's now being added. But I don't think this is a major corner turn. It won't be a corner turn for me until the goalkeeper goes. I think the goalkeeper's a major problem for them. But yeah, running it back to Liverpool. I mean, where should we start? We'll go first goal. I mean, it wasn't great, was it?
No.
Virgil Van Dijk. What are you saying, mate?
I mean, it's funny because we were talking last week about his defensive strategy and whether it's down to some kind of instruction from Alisson to kind of clear his view, or whether it's down to him kind of like holding himself back on the back of his injury, or whether it's just he feels like he doesn't have to exert himself in the same way anymore. Well, I feel like all three of those things kind of came to a head in that first goal, because you did see him not really put in that extra burst of pace to get in front of his man. Then when he's blocking the shot, like when Sancho does his chop that kind of kills Milner, Virgil doesn't know that he's also got Alisson on the floor. So if the plan was to stay out of his line of vision, that plan would have been aborted as soon as he knew that the goalkeeper was already on the floor. But he didn't know that. So if that was the case, then he should have then stuck his leg out. But he didn't. So it kind of, in my mind, gives a bit more credence to that being why it's happening. But whatever the reason, it does not look good. And this is the third game out of 3 that there's been an error around a goal where we can highlight Virgil van Dijk. He's not the only one. Obviously, going back to the application again, we have to mention Trent. Everyone who's seen the replays now of him jogging back into position, and we can talk about energy and effort and stuff like that, but that's very early in the game. Very early in the game. The score is 0-0. Manchester United have been on. They've been on in the ascendancy. But you've seen so many times when teams are in the ascendancy, if they don't get that goal, then it can dissipate just as quickly. You should know that. You should be putting all of your effort into getting back. But he gives up. He literally gives up before the goal scored. And for me, that's unacceptable. The things with Virgil could be down to a multitude of things. That effort application should just be there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's Van Dijk, I don't know what's specifically up with him, if I'm honest. I think in that moment, James Milner's spot on with what he's saying. James Milner's absolutely right to have a go at him for not closing down the shot. You have to close down the shooter in that moment if he's on the ball, in space, on the penalty spot. You can't just stand there like a statue. And that was kind of what he did. It's a shame that Milner's the one who's having to have a go at him, because Milner probably knows in himself that his own game isn't particularly great at the minute. But it's absolutely right that he had to go at Van Dijk. And I must be honest, since we've been recording this show years and years now, you can probably count the number of times I've criticised Van Dijk on one hand. Very, very rarely do I ever go at him. Yeah. And it's almost a case of, when I do want to criticise him or see something that I would work on, I almost have to second guess myself, because he's that good that you almost look at yourself and think, have I got this wrong?
But you know what? I think that's part of the problem. Now, I'm not saying that he himself has got complacent, but he is very aware of the aura that he has with the opposition players. I mean, he speaks to them, he sees them. We hear them talking about him in interviews all the time, the way that they kind of revere him as a defender. So he knows what he does to people. So sometimes that's a big part of his defensive armory. It's almost like he's daring them to do stuff. Well, now people are doing stuff. So now you've got to change it up.
Yeah. I mean, he across the 3 games so far, he has not been great. He has been, I'd go as far as saying he's probably been bad. He's been nowhere near his usual level. He's, just for a little bit of weird perspective, he's already committed 4 fouls. Last season, he committed 10 all season. And he played virtually every game, I think. It does seem a little bit like almost complacency, or almost like I don't know if there's like a weird thing in the squad now where specifically players like Van Dijk and Gomez are looking around, seeing the whole squad drop like flies in terms of injuries. they know themselves that they've had big knocks and the World Cup's in the winter. I don't know what it is. If it can be a mental thing, but
I mean,
he
you
does
ever
look
think,
like he's reluctant to play at 100%, and as a result of doing that, he's not able to coast. He's not coasting particularly well so far.
no, well, I mean, I think about the start of last season again when they were all just coming back from injury. Him and Matip both came back at the same time, but I felt like in those early games it was Matip who was doing a lot of the kind of front foot defending. He was doing a lot of the sprints, the duels in the air, and the kind of covering off the early man, where Virgil was kind of covering the back using his Jedi mind tricks, obviously. And that worked. And that worked really well while Virgil got up to speed. And then towards the kind of autumn to time, he kind of clicked back into the Virgil we know and love. And from there was fantastic. This season, if you look at it, he's had 3 different partners in 3 different league games. That's going to make a difference, particularly when you think about the difference between going from Matip to Phillips and then back down to Gomez. And I mean, as much as him and Gomez have got a great partnership and had a great partnership, it's been a while since they've played together. It's been a long time since they played together. I believe it was, according to Carragher commentary, the 7-2, which is like 10 seasons ago. Like, and yes, obviously they'd have had training, etc. But you can't tell me game isn't different. A game at Old Trafford again is different again. So you can see where he might be a little bit compromised to a certain extent. But still, these are minor things that a player of his caliber normally is able to brush off. And I'm sure we're going to probably talk about positions and average positions and all that kind of stuff as well. I saw the average position for this game, and he looked at a lot considerably deeper than I was expecting him to be. And I don't know what that's down to. I don't know whether, again, it's going back to his form, his fitness, whether he trusts his body as well. But it was noticeable.
I mean, just looking at the 3 games so far, you know, if you think of Liverpool's 2 difference makers when he was signed, Alisson and Van Dijk, so far both of them have played every single minute, but they just haven't really made the difference that they usually do. So in the first game, I think Mitrovic's header, I think Alisson should save it personally. Later in the game, Van Dijk concedes a penalty against Palace. I mean, it is a wonderful finish from Wilfried Zaha, but Van Dijk kind of allows the shot and Alisson gets beat, you know. So maybe you could argue in previous seasons when they're both a bit more on it, maybe they deal with that a little bit better. And then against Manchester United, again, Van Dijk's majorly at fault for the first game. If the first goal doesn't really have a great game, and then later in the match, Alisson faces a 1v1 with Marcus Rashford, usually dominates them, but again gets beat. So I think a lot of Liverpool's issues at the minute stem from those big difference makers in the team. They're basically the team's best players, and you can include the likes of Fabinho in this as well. Just don't look themselves. They just don't look usual level. It's really weird. You'd think we'd been, you know, you'd think we'd been playing 50 games, but the fact we're 3 games in, it's really strange and it's hard to explain. I think Klopp has almost been a bit taken aback by it because it's not something you can predict. It's not specifically tactical. It's not.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It is weird, and that's why, I mean, he made the one flippant offhand mark about the witch, and people have jumped on it because it seems almost out of character for what he said. But it does speak to a certain kind of, it's out of our controlness about it. And if you think about the way football teams are run these days, particularly the way our football team is run, control is a big part of it. Be able to control everything in your environment. And I think back to the relinquishing of control that Klopp had over pre-season. He didn't want to go on a lucrative preseason tour, but we did because we hadn't done it in a while and we had to. And that made a difference to the way the preseason ended up being. And then you have a knock-on effect from there. I think about the end of last season. I still think as much as we've got a lot to take from the way that we played last season, the fact that it was, again, such tiny margins, like 1 point, 1 goal away from immortality. And you can't tell me as humans that's not going to be on your mind. And then you come into the season and then you start slowly and then you look across the Man City and they've started like a house on fire. and you're already on the back foot, and your mind starts drifting, thinking, oh. And all of those things aren't going to be the deciding factor, but they are all the things that can add up when you string them together. And then you throw in the injuries. And the injuries that have happening now are starting to look like the injuries that happened 2 seasons ago. And that didn't happen at all last season, really. So it's almost like that big pendulum that swung over there, swung back. And if you think back to how horrible mentally that period was for everybody, particularly those players, the idea of that coming back, it's going to have an effect as well.
Yeah, it is a scary thought, and I think it's in Klopp. I don't think I'll ever leave Klopp, to be honest, considering how much it scarred him that season. But I've just touched on Milner earlier. You know, when it comes to Van Dijk's moments, I just wanted to have a little bit of a conversation about him, because he's a difficult one for us to analyse, because the bottom line is I feel a bit sorry for him. I don't think he should be playing in these games from the off. I don't think he should be starting 2 Premier League games in a row, specifically when one of them is away at Old Trafford. Last season, I think he developed a role for himself where he would be the man to introduce, specifically when Liverpool have a lead with about 20 minutes left, and he'd kind of come on as a bit of a coach almost on the pitch, relay instructions from the sidelines that have been given to him before he came on, and he'd commit the odd tactical foul, waste time, and just kind of offer that kind of intangible experience, whatever that even means. But this season, he's having to play more of a part, despite the fact he's 36 and could have easily left the club in the summer. So before we go too hard on him or anything like that, I did just want to give him a shout towards, like, it's kind of a shame that he's part of the problem at the minute in the team, because he's not playing particularly well. But I still value him in the squad. It's just a shame he's playing such an integral part at the moment.
That's exactly it. I think when you look over the course of a season and over the course of a squad, no one would really argue that there's still a viable place for James Milner. It's specific times, but that's the problem with time. Those times become more and more specific. And those times haven't occurred in those first 2 or 3 games. It's not what you're talking about. In fact, I did something about it earlier on in the season about Milner, looking at him last year. And he was actually at his most successful when he was playing in the 6. Now, that's not what you necessarily expect with him. But again, the energy that's required there compared to maybe being an 8 and having to get up and down, it's probably a bit more suited to him these days. If you look at the game against Manchester United, the amount of times there was big spaces, they weren't able to protect the counter-attack threat. They weren't able to cover over in the way that even Fabinho's a lot better at. So, yeah, like you say, the task that's been given to him doesn't really put him in a position to succeed. And then on top of that, I feel like he, as one of the leaders in that team, is probably the one who's most aware of this malaise, and he's trying his best to try and fight his way out of it. But sometimes by doing that, he's kind of, making the team a bit more unbalanced. He's running here, there, and everywhere. I mean, I think, again, going back to the average positions, I think he's the closest one we had to a centre forward in terms of average positions, which, if you sat him down after the game and said, James, do you think you should be the one in the centre forward position? He'd probably say no.
He was everywhere, to be fair. And again, like, some of that comes down to the game plan. We will touch on that in a sec. But just in terms of his performance against United, we did mention it maybe last week or the week before about pass completion numbers. Now, it's obviously the most basic stat in the world. Doesn't really offer that much of an insight, but it can offer some insight into a level of control that you have over the game, right? Mm-hmm. In this match, Liverpool's 2 lowest pass completion players, if you like, were Trent Alexander-Arnold, bottom, as usual, and Mohamed Salah. Liverpool's 2 biggest risk takers and Liverpool's probably 2 biggest threats. So I've got no real issue with that. But again, if you remove those 2, bottom of the list again is James Milner. And we spoke about that a few weeks ago. I think he was bottom them as well. So when it comes to playing him in the middle of the park, specifically in these kind of intense games where the ball's kind of fumbling about and things, he's not the best when it comes to establishing the level of control Liverpool need to win games. On top of his very low pass completion for the match, he posted one progressive pass. So you can't really say that. Okay, he's losing the ball often, but is he adding value with his passes? Because he posted one progressive pass. For a bit of perspective on that, Harvey Elliott posted a better pass completion and posted 8 progressive passes. So that's kind of more of what you're after, I suppose. So in terms of Milner again, I am conscious of having too much of a go on him and highlighting that he's an issue because it's pretty obvious, really, isn't it? But the issue is that he's playing, not that he's a bad player, by any means. It's that he's having to take to the field in these high profile games and he's playing 72 minutes. So it's not ideal.
It's not ideal. It's difficult because you look at that and you think, is it more an idea where even though we're in this position where Liverpool have only got really old or really young midfielders. I spoke about it a little bit last week. I wrote an article about it on .com if you want to go and read it. But it's kind of hitting home here. So you basically have to choose between energy and experience rather than having both. And maybe the 2 experience, 1 energy ratio that we had against Manchester United probably wasn't right. Maybe we could have gone 2 energy, 1 experience. I know it's a big game, but when you look at the results, maybe this is just hindsight talking. When you look at the results, I think, like you say, if James Milner's not able to find his teammates, if we know that he's taking up very central high positions and still not able to find his teammates, and is still not able to stop counterattacks coming through, it's hard to find a positive in his selection there. And so that's another thing that annoyed me in the game, to be honest. I felt like as much as Klopp didn't really have anyone to trust so much on the bench, I still think that when the game's going that badly for that long, you have to change it, regardless.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason it went bad was because of the game plan. I have touched on this in a piece recently, which did quite well in terms of retweets. But I had to suffer a bit of abuse, as usual. I think I've got another 10 people compared to before on the block list, I think. But yeah, Liverpool's approach for the game, right? So before the game, Klopp touched on in his pre-match interview, he specifically mentioned the fact that Erik ten Hag adopts a defensive approach that is kind of man-marking, basically. Liverpool's approach, for context, is zonal. So you don't get that many proper man-marking schemes out there. You get like Marcel Bielsa's Leeds, Atalanta, when we faced Atalanta in the Champions League, teams like that. And when Liverpool faced the likes of Leeds, especially, because it's man-marking, you can kind of just say to your front players, basically, go anywhere. And if you run anywhere and if you vacate your designated position, if you like, it can really disrupt a man-marking scheme and it can result in chaos, essentially. And with United having 2 games behind them in the Premier League under Ten Hag, I can see the logic in wanting to use such a strategy to basically instigate chaos in United's defensive ranks. But I think it caused more harm than good for Liverpool. I think it confused Liverpool more than United, because I don't think United, although they're man-orientated, I don't think they weren't like Leeds or Atalanta, where it's literally you stick to your man wherever he goes. It's like full 100% intense man marking. United weren't really that, so it ended up kind of confusing Liverpool's system. I thought Milner ended up as their most advanced player sometimes. Elliott was on the left sometimes rather than the right. Trent was inside a lot. Henderson was sometimes more advanced than Firmino, which, when you think about it, is a bit insane. But it was all intentional as a means of disrupting United. I just think it was in the early stages, especially. It was too much of an overload. It was overflowing almost, and the fact that we couldn't keep the ball made it even worse.
Yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. I think when you're asking the team to be a little bit more freestyle, particularly the front players, what you are hopefully relying on is those front players in particular being in form, and having confidence. And I mean, Mo Salah feels like he always has confidence regardless, but it's hard to say that he's in red hot form right now. And that was kind of what we saw. It was almost like they were all kind of straining, but because they were all kind of freewheeling it, there was no kind of joined up thinking. And so there was a little bit too much isolation. Again, going back to the average, I keep referencing that average positions thing because I looked at it and instantly it told me what was wrong. Like sometimes you look at some stats and you think, oh, okay, maybe. Like I looked at that and I just said, yeah, that's not how Liverpool are meant to play. The fullbacks were far too deep. The front three, which are normally between the width of the post, the width of the penalty area, are way, way wider. Like I mentioned, Virgil and Joe Gomez were a lot deeper than their midfielders, and there wasn't as much connection. There were maybe a few groups here, a few groups there, but there didn't seem to be a joined up plan. And to be honest with you, when you are a team who is low on confidence, the kind of way we are, feeling a bit sorry for ourselves, you kind of want to stick to the plan. Like when you don't know what to do, just stick to what you know, and hopefully that will keep going. But we kind of did the opposite, and it didn't really work.
No, I mean one of the major downsides of the way things transpired, specifically in the first half, was Roberto Firmino. That was he was who I wrote the piece on, because I kind of felt sorry for him watching the game. I thought he played fairly well, to be honest. He roamed more than ever before from his position, which we know he does anyway. That's kind of what we've become accustomed to. But he did it times 10, basically.
Yeah.
I think he posted more touches in the middle third than in any single Premier League game that he's ever played, which kind of offers an insight into how deep he was coming.
Yeah.
But again, touching on Man United's man marking scheme, that was kind of the plan. His plan was to come deep, and the plan was to come deep, and his game, it's always been associated with just providing glue and linking things, connecting things, being Liverpool's connector, and that's exactly what he did, just in deeper areas than usual.
Yeah.
The issue is the rest of the system didn't really work, and as a result of the rest of the system not working, it looked like Firmino was just kind of going off the map, and it resulted in supporters kind of being a bit like, we haven't got a striker, where on earth is he going? We need goals. But it's part of his instructions, if you see what I mean, and his role on the day. I think he completed something like 44 of his 52 passes. So in terms of keeping the ball in position and not providing that glue, which he's always done, he did exactly that. He just got kind of let down by the structure around him, I felt.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think both you and the people who are saying we needed a proper forward are right. I think that he was doing what he was asked, and he was doing it well. What we normally see when he comes in is, particularly in a man marking system, one of the defenders come out, which they didn't really so much do, because if they did, there'd have been space. But the other thing that normally happens is that the wider forwards come inside and use that space. And
exactly,
I think that was something that Klopp mentioned in his post-match interview. From the first to the second half, he wanted Salah closer to the goal, because again, him and Diaz were way wide. Like normally you have everybody except the fullbacks in that central strip, and they were both outside of it. And when you've got Firmino who's linking with the midfielders, the point is, like I say, he comes deep. There was a space behind him, and then the people he's linking with, or him himself, are able to find those runners. But those runners weren't running for whatever reason, and so you get a kind of a disjointed system. In some ways, you can look at that Firmino performance and say that if you added a Nunez in front of him, it would have been fantastic. You can almost say, okay, maybe that's going to be the future of Firmino as a Liverpool player, playing that tip of the midfield diamond, but having a striker ahead of him. And once again, we go back to circumstances, the only reason we weren't able to do that. So then you think, okay, well, we've got a game plan that would have worked perfectly if we had this. Maybe that means we shouldn't have used that game plan if we don't have this.
I mean, I think it would have worked a lot better if, as you say, if Diaz and Salah were permanently kind of within the width of the penalty box, as you say. You know, no wider than that. But the issue was Firmino was dropping off, and you know, trying to take players with him and connecting in the middle of the park and things like that. But nobody was kind of filling the void then by coming inside. Salah was remaining wide, Diaz was remaining wide, and Liverpool. Usually, when people say strikerless, it's not really strikerless because somebody is constantly occupying the space of the striker, whether it's a midfielder or whatever. This was strikerless in its truest form, really, because Firmino was kind of getting off, and he was not being replaced. Nobody was kind of occupying the space until the second half, and in the second half, Firmino continued to drop off, but not as deep. Salah and Diaz were a bit more narrow, and things just worked a bit better. Liverpool played a lot better in the second half, retained possession a bit better. But yeah, it was just a lot of things went wrong. It was a nightmare. But I personally think that Firmino has played worse than that at Old Trafford, and Liverpool have scored 4. But because in this game we got beat and we looked so disjointed at the start, and people were so kind of confused with what we were trying to do, he became the scapegoat for me. But
well, it was the obvious difference, wasn't it? Again, like you say, if you don't know the game plan, the interesting thing for me was the second half, particularly particularly when Fabio Carvalho came on, was when I was most interested, because you had Firmino still operating in those deeper positions. Then you had Diaz ahead of him in the striker role, and for Fabio Carvalho operating wide from the left. Now that looked like a formation that suited all three of those players. Now, we've still got another game to play before Núñez comes back. I wonder if we see that, whether from the start or in the next game, because it was able to, like I say, Diaz has those central striker instincts as well. He has great movement, so he's able to find space within those central positions. Fabio Carvalho played a lot of time with Fulham off the left, and as you say, you still got Bobby Firmino there. Carvalho, one of the things he was really good at Fulham was arriving late in the box, whether he's from wide or from central. And when you've got that kind of plan with Firmino coming, dropping deep and creating space, then you need someone to be coming in late to kind of mess with their game plan. That's the whole crux of that whole tactic. So I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I did touch on when we first got Carvalho win and things. I touched on how he's got that Coutinho nature to him, but he also has a little bit of Dele Alli in him, personally, in terms of his tendency to just arrive at the right time. And we did see a little bit of that, as you just said. But I suppose that opens up the conversation for the midfield department. Now, it's the talking point at the minute, isn't it? You know, Liverpool needs to buy a midfielder and all that stuff. I'm not going to go galaxy brain on this. Liverpool do need a midfielder. It's pretty obvious. You know, I think everybody would accept that. The issue is, for me, I am absolutely 1,000,000% in the camp that you should not force it and you should get the right player in. So my issue would just be the fact Liverpool haven't moved suggests the right player is not there in their eyes. And that would be my worry, to start saying, go and buy a player, because I do not want them to go and buy someone who, further down the line, will become a little bit redundant.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, and I agree. The other way of looking at it is maybe their eyes need adjusting. Now, that sounds kind of cavalier because they've got a lot of credit in the bank. But what I mean by that is that they set the bar very high to become a Liverpool player. Very, very high. And that has worked for us so far. And part of the reason why that's highest of all in midfield is because, again, you think about what they're asked to do. It's different playing in a Liverpool midfield when you're playing with Trent and Robbo than playing in a midfield for nearly any other team, because of the demands put on you, because of the demands that they have to do within the team structure. So, again, the gene pool, in theory, narrows. Me personally, I thought Matheus Núñez would have done the job. I really do.
Yeah.
But the problem with this high bar is that it means that you're putting a higher premium on those who've already cleared that bar. i.e. the players already in the squad. And so the problems with them, i.e. the fact that the availability, are minimalized, because you think, okay, but they've got this really big plus, the fact that we know that they can play in our team. And it's like, when you've got one or two of those in a bank of 9 midfielders, that's fine. When you've got 5 in a bank of 9 midfielders, that's a problem. And let's not forget, 12 months from now, Keita, Oxlade-Chamberlain, and Milner will be out of contract after spending all this time talking about how on earth did we get in a situation where we were having to do deals for Salah, Mane, and Firmino in the same summer. We're doing the same thing again. So this is why I'm saying we need to buy someone now, because like next summer, I don't want to be sitting here having this conversation saying, why are we trying to buy 3 midfielders in one go? That's a really, really upheaval. We knew this already. Let's sort it out now.
Yeah, my issue is just who. That would be my thing. Like, I've seen lots of calls, for example, for Lucas Susic, who's currently at Red Bull Salzburg. And if you actually put that into perspective, right? Lucas Susic turns 20 in 2 weeks, so he's currently a teenager, and supporters are talking like Liverpool's whole situation or whatever will be fine, or better at least, if we go and sign a 19-year-old from the Austrian Bundesliga. So, things like that. You don't want to put too much pressure on the kid for a start, and he's probably not going to solve the problem single-handedly. He's quite clearly a player for the future and things. So, deals like that, I'm just not sure it's entirely worth it, really. But I do think Liverpool's midfield department is a problem at the minute. Teams are getting through to the last line too easy. Man United did it, and I tweeted during the game, Trent was trying to play his usual passing game as he always will. Hollywood passes all the time, and that's what he's in the team to do. That's the role he's being presented with. The reason we don't usually suffer too much from that is because the loose balls on the back of his risks, when they go wrong, the loose balls get swept up by Liverpool's midfield. That's always been the case. Fabinho's great at, Henderson's been doing it, Wijnaldum, Thiago, whatever. But this season, specifically against Fulham and against United, those balls haven't really been swept up to the same level. They haven't really been hoovered up at all, and you kind of need that to happen. Otherwise, every time a player takes a risk like Trent, you will suffer a counter-attack. And I remember a few years back, Spurs suffered from this. Spurs continue to play the same way with the likes of Eriksen taking risks, but those loose balls that a teammate would sweep up to then start the next attack and the next attack and the next attack. Spurs didn't replace, I think it might have been Moussa Dembele who left. Victor Wanyama got injured all the time. And Spurs then started to kind of decline a little bit. So it definitely needs sorting. I don't know how long the injured players are away from returning. That obviously plays a massive factor. Yes. But it is a bit of a risk if Liverpool go into this season now with the midfield department in the current state that it is.
I agree, and I can see why they have decided to make decisions they have. I can see within their remit why it makes sense, because you can look at it and say they're more likely to pay big money on younger players like Susic than a player who's already in their peak years, say like a Nicolo Barella, because you're going to have a higher sell-on value. But the fact is that the sell-on value and the profit and the benefit of that sell-on value is nullified by the fact that right here and now, the greater need is players in their peak years within that midfield, players who are ready to go now, players who are able to transform it immediately. And then, like you say, we've got all these players who are only a little bit injured, but still unavailable right now. So you don't want to think, okay, we're going to get to a situation if we buy loads of midfielders, suddenly we're going to have too many knocking around the place. Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be losing 3 of them next summer. So you want to get some of them in now. And then obviously, so even if you do get to a situation where in February and March, and it feels like there's some good players left out of the squad, that's only going to be a situation for another few months.
I mean, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on potential players who would fill the void, Mo, but a few players have been linked. For example, like Moises Caicedo has been linked of Brighton. One of the reasons I think that is possible is because he somehow he is apparently on less than £4,000 a week.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, regardless of how long he's contracted for, that would not be an expensive deal to do. And if he would come in as a player, you could probably realistically give him less than £50,000 a week, and he'd probably rip your hand off. So that could be a really cheap solution for Liverpool to explore. He's only 20, but he does look like he started the season well.
Yes.
Yori Tillemans is another player out there. Don't know what's happening there. Don't know why anyone's trying to get him. But maybe there's reasons behind that. And I'm not sure he's got that intense tag that you probably need to play for Liverpool. I'm not sure he's that kind of player. He's more of a technician, isn't he?
Yes.
I had a little look for a piece earlier in the week as well. There's a lad out there called Fabian Ruiz. He's 29. He's 26 at the minute, so he's a little bit beyond Liverpool's age curve, age criteria. But he runs out of contract next year. He's reportedly in talks with, well, not in talks, but PSG are reportedly interested in him. They haven't agreed to fee or anything like that yet, but he's a player who can play as a number 8, can play as a 6, established Champions League player. Year left on his deal, but Liverpool aren't getting linked with him. So I do think there's one or two solutions out there, but they're just maybe they're not Bellingham, Tchouaméni solutions.
No. And this is the thing, isn't it? Is that Liverpool don't settle. Liverpool don't buy someone who they wouldn't have bought only for a situation. They change the timeline of when they're going to buy people, but they're not going to buy someone who they hadn't already considered, which is sometimes frustrating because you see sometimes those opportunities can be taken. I mean, to be honest, I do feel like Shaqiri was probably one area where that didn't happen, where it was just an opportunity that came up, and he was just like, okay, well, the downsides aren't very high. But outside of that lack of flexibility sometimes can you can look at it in hindsight and think that might cost us, because yes, we trust our transfer committee. They've been very good, but they're not always right. I mean, like, we always remember Klopp wanted Brand over Mohamed Salah, but like, some people say, oh, that proves the transfer committee know what they're doing. But it also proves that sometimes you have to change your mind. Sometimes the guy that you didn't think was the guy is actually the guy. So I do think that an idea of widening that pool, I'm looking like I said, Nicola Barella, someone else who I like, who I know that we won't be in for, who I think would do quite well, Sergei Milinkovic-Savic. Genuinely, like, I think we've got to the stage now where the profile of guy who we're looking for is a bit wider, because we're looking for more than one. And I do think we're going to need someone who's going to have a little bit more physicality. That's something we're lacking. And height, something else we're lacking. He is someone who has ability of intelligence with his runs, so he'll be able to arrive late, like we mentioned before, Fabio Carvalho. Probably passing stats would need a little bit of an improvement, but I can see a world where he works well in our team. Another guy who I like, who again is quite young, Maxence Kakare at Lyon. I think he's a fantastic player. I think that if we can find a way to get him into our team at some point in the future, then we will be set for a long, long time. He looks the absolute business. But again, he is a young player. To ask him to come in and instantly transform the team is asking a lot. So I would say for the immediate future, I wouldn't be looking at him, but he's one I'd have on my list for the summer for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think, say for example, Barella, I think Liverpool would absolutely explore that one. But the issue with Barella is he's contracted until 2026. So that would be another 4 years on his deal. And he earns about what Mane was in, I think. So that would be an expensive deal for Liverpool to do. But I think Liverpool would do it, but just if they did it now, it would be a lot very costly.
Well,
I think if you look at Liverpool's problem at the minute, whatever midfielder we get in, I think has to kind of be a bit like Tchouaméni in the sense that he leans towards the defensive side more than the offensive side of the game.
Yeah.
So to round up the show this week, we're not going to have enough time to talk about Bournemouth, but to round up the show this week, I think we should touch on overall what is going wrong for the season so far. We're 3 games in, we haven't won a game yet. 2 draws, 1 loss. It's not great. how much should we worry is basically the quick talking point with this one. But one thing I wanted to touch on first, just to capture what the numbers are suggesting, is it's basically what we all know anyway, but you can see it clear in the numbers. So far this season for expected goals, this is not including penalties. Expected goals, Liverpool are third in the table, behind Arsenal, who've played, I think off the top of my head, 3 relatively alright fixtures. I don't think they've played anyone big yet. And Manchester City, shock. So in that sense, Liverpool's attack is pretty okay. In terms of shots, Liverpool are second to only Manchester City. So in the attacking department, and this was the case last year as well, Liverpool are fine, really. Defensive side of the game is a little bit different. So top of the table is Arsenal, Manchester City, Wolves, Brighton, Spurs, Leeds, Brentford, Chelsea, Everton, West Ham.
Wait, Everton?
Everton. And then Liverpool. So Liverpool have conceded so far. Liverpool have given up shots worth about 3.7 XG, which has them about mid-table. In terms of the shots they've faced, they've actually faced the third fewest shots. They've only faced 29. City and Arsenal are the only two who are better in that sense. But if you look at the expected goals per shot, Liverpool are the worst in the league. So what that essentially means is Liverpool don't give away much in terms of volume, but when they do, it's clear-cut. The clear-cut chances. So Liverpool every now and then get cut open.
And that's structure. That's entire structure. What that is, the reason why we don't concede a lot of shots is because we dominate possession. And so the opposition don't literally have the ball enough to have those more shots. But because we dominate possession and because of the way that we are flooding teams, when we lose it, we are leaving ourselves vulnerable in a way that we hadn't done previously. That really feels like the whole thing. When you look at the goals, like we were talking last week about the quality of shots, and we are getting a lot of shots. The XG is high. Traditionally, with those kind of things, over the course of a longer period of time, it will kind of regress back to the average once we get Darwin Núñez back, Diogo Jota back, and not just back, but Jota feeling himself, feeling firing. Those numbers will start to look better in terms of we're actually scoring more goals as well as getting high shots and high XG. The other side, that structural part of it, you worry because at the moment, you look at Thiago to come back, he'll probably make an improvement. But outside of that, there's not really many people missing from where we should normally be. So then it's like, I mean, how many of the guys who are out are going to be first choice? I'd say just Thiago.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that's a good point.
So yeah, you think about it and you think, okay, well, that's more than just getting players back. Is it physical? Are they going back to what we were saying before, the hangover from last season? And if that is the case, well, then that's a tougher fix.
Well, this is why Liverpool wanted Tchouaméni, and it is a shame because he was genuinely perfect for this.
Really
he can play as an 8, he can play as a 6, and he was a defensive-minded midfielder who just naturally swept up balls in the middle of the field. That was just what he did naturally, and he's just very, very good at it. He's like a spider. And Liverpool lack that player. I think Liverpool need that player. And some of the players who are available at the minute, you know, you don't want to sign them and they don't really address your problem. Like I mentioned Tielemans. Does Tielemans address that? I'm not really sure
I don't
he does.
think so. No.
And if you look at Liverpool's numbers so far this season, in terms of their matches, we haven't really touched on that so much this season so far, but Liverpool haven't really deserved to win any of the games they've played. Against Fulham, they posted next year 1.9. Fulham posted 1.4 with the penalty. So that you haven't done enough there to put the result beyond reasonable doubt. That you can still get easily there. Then against Palace, Liverpool posted 1.7 XG. Palace posted 1.5. That's a draw. And against Manchester United, Liverpool posted 1.5. and Palace and Man United posted 1.7. So again, that's a draw probably. So Liverpool haven't really dominated a game yet in terms of doing a lot at one end and keeping things really quiet at the other end. They haven't really done it once yet. So it doesn't bode well, but just for a bit of to end on a nice note, in terms of the attacking numbers I touched on before, so far this season, bottom of the whole Premier League for XG is Bournemouth. And bottom of the whole Premier League for shots is Bournemouth. And it's not even close. They have played City, to be fair to them. But it offers a bit of hope, I suppose. We'll have to see where we go with that. Mo, have you got anything to close?
Well, I mean, I was going to say Bournemouth will probably look at that and say, well, we've played Arsenal and Man City. They're the two best teams. So that obviously our numbers are going to be bad. But in all honesty, it's hard to not overreact because what we've seen in previous years where a lead can be hard to kind of overcome sometimes. But at the same time, it's the fact that there's lots of the people who we've been able to rely on for so long who haven't looked themselves at the thing that's most worrying me. I think we will look better when our players come back, but I think it might take more than that to start to look like Liverpool that we know and love. But I still think we'll beat Bournemouth.
Yeah, I do as well. I mean, you have to put it into perspective, and you have to remember that we do have a notable number of injuries at the minute, suspensions, and it's just not ideal. And on top of that, you have established top performers who just for whatever reason seem off their usual level. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we can address is the second element that I've just touched on there. If we play against Bournemouth and the likes of Van Dijk, Fabinho and Alisson in particular, what we expect in terms of performance, Liverpool should have enough to start getting back to winning ways, and we can take it from there basically. But yeah, early days, it doesn't look great yet, but we'll see where we go with it. Yeah. So Mo, thanks for joining us, mate.
No problem. Hopefully next time we're talking about some good Liverpool play as well.
Yeah, first time this season, hopefully. And to the listeners, thanks for tuning in, and be sure to do the same again next week. See you then.